Hello again, and welcome to Slow-Mo's channel. So what I'm going to be going over today is our space exploration and equipment stuff. Um, and it's pretty short notes. It's two different notes that we're going to glue into our journal, and it's pretty straightforward. It's going to be a lot of writing, but it's pretty quick. So to start off with, our space exploring notes, we need to know about the equipment that we use for exploration, including the telescope, which is what Galileo invented. And with this telescope, the very first telescope, he was able to view some of Jupiter's moons, and so we call these the Galilean moons. And this was back in 1610. A space probe is something that we send out into space to gather information. For example, the Hubble telescope, which we talked about a little bit and was in a video that I showed you, that is considered a space probe because it's kind of just out there journeying towards somewhere and taking pictures of things and sending back data from space. A satellite is going to be something that orbits something else. So we have satellites that are orbiting Earth that give us our cell phone data and cell phone service. We also have some that give us our TV service. We have some that take pictures, that give us GPS coordinates, all of that sort of stuff. So those are out there also collecting data and even dispersing data. And there's tons of them out there, and a lot of them are space junk. Basically satellites that don't work anymore, that we don't use anymore. But they're still floating out there. So we actually have a lot of trash in space too. But there's about 1,000 that are still working. So here I've got a couple more tools or instruments that we use, like a space rover. We talked about Curiosity, still traveling around on Mars right now. And so this is something that's unmanned, that is on the surface of something, in this case Mars, or it could be the moon, and it's exploring, collecting data, that sort of thing. That's a rover. And then the space shuttle is the program that we used to use to get to space, including the International Space Station, which we'll talk about in a little while. The important thing about the space shuttle is that it was the first spacecraft that had this level of reusability. So each one of the space shuttles, which there's several of them out there now, they're basically at museums. They were specifically designed to be able to go out into space and then come back and land and then be prepped again to go out into space again. And so this was going to save NASA and the US a lot of money, not having to build something from scratch every time they wanted to go out into space. And so that was the big deal with the space shuttle. They have since been retired. And so we're actually going into the next generation of how we're going to travel into space. And really, it's going to be more commercial flights. In other words, you've heard of Elon Musk and other people trying to get into space, and like the SpaceX program and all of that stuff. Basically, there's companies now, privately held companies and publicly held companies, that are working with the federal government in a partnership to get astronauts into space. And so let's talk a little bit about the timeline. So here in 1610, we just talked about Galileo. In 1957, this was a really big deal. Russia got Sputnik into space, and they basically won the space race. We had the first man, that was the first man-made object, to orbit Earth. And so that really freaked out the US, and we were like, man, we lost the space race. But hey, maybe we can be the first ones to get people into space and that sort of thing. And so Sputnik going out into space, was kind of like what started the space race. And the whole thing was, who's going to be able to get to the moon first and that sort of stuff. In 1958, we have our first weather satellite, which was done by the U.S. 1960, NASA was founded. And in 61, Russia got the first man into space. But then shortly after that, we had the first American in space. And in 1963, there was the first woman in space who was also Russian. But then in 1969, the US got the first human on the moon. And then in 1983, we had our first American woman in space, which was Sally Ride. And you'll see a picture of her right there. And then we have in 1990 was the first picture of the solar system, because you have to remember that in order to take a picture of something, you have to be outside of it, right? Like if I want to take a picture of our entire school, I have to be standing outside of the school. So that was when we first got our first picture of the solar system. And then in 1998, we began to build the International Space Station, which is what this picture is right here. And we're going to be talking about that more in depth with the next page of notes. And then in 2009, our first crew was on the International Space Station. And then in 2012, we had our first commercial flight to the International Space Station. And now we have lots of commercial flights that, are taking people out into space and things like that. So that's kind of like the next level of what we're going to be doing next. So let me move on. And this is our next bit of notes. Our next page is all about the International Space Station. The way that I think about the International Space Station is it's kind of like a big building that's orbiting Earth. And there's people that live in it, and there's experiments that are going on in there, and there's food that astronauts have. And we're going to be watching some videos about the International Space Station. And they hopefully, want to they want to make it a staging sort of, I think of it like kind of like a gas station, right? When you're on a really, really long road trip, you have to stop at the gas station to get snacks and fuel and things like that. And ultimately, I think that's one of the things that they want to kind of do with the International Space Station for future trips, to Mars, etc. So it's the largest man-made body in orbit, and it does have gravity. It spins to create gravity in there, but it's not very much gravity, right? Microgravity. And so they do some research in there. And so they want to know, it's, how's gravity or no gravity, going to affect these plants and stuff like that. It orbits Earth 15.5 times each day. I talked about the next bullet. And astronauts do sleep in, basically they look like sleeping bags, and you kind of get zipped into your sleeping bag and you're kind of just floating there inside your sleeping bag. So we'll watch some videos about the International Space Station, or the ISS. So here's a picture of it on the inside of your notes. And it's got solar panels on it. And those are what give it its power and everything. And you'll see here in the middle that it looks like a giant cube, or a hallway. That's where the astronauts live, and that's where they have their experiments and everything going on in space. And so what's really fascinating about the International Space Station is that there are a bunch of countries that have come together to make this happen. So it's not just, it doesn't just belong to the United States. It belongs to all these other countries, including Russia and Canada. And they come together to work together, to do experiments, to help each other out. And so it's a really great example of these countries working together to do science, which is why the International Space Station really fascinates me. So I'll leave you here with a picture of Shlomo in space. This was actually taken at this teacher space academy that I went to. And I'll show you guys some videos of me in the 1/6 chair, where basically they put you in this little chair sort of thing where you bounce around, and it feels like what the gravity would feel like on the moon. And this multi-axis trainer where they spin you around and stuff like that. And so Shlomo got to go too, and I'll show you some videos of that. So I'll see you guys in class. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.